Thanks ever so much for this opportunity. I know that there's a real sort of a group spirit around this topic of resilience. You're in the sort of one of the hubs, largely by Angie's efforts. There's a huge amount of momentum on some of these ideas, especially in terms of community developmental practices and reaching out to marginalized populations and all these kinds of approaches that I know that the university here has really spearheaded, both in terms of your country as well as internationally. I think, Angie, you're over in my country about as often as I'm here for a variety of different things and hosting talks and that type of thing. Including, by the way, we have a really large conference happening in Halifax, Canada in June. Check out our website if you want to sort of really get immersed in this topic for a bit. My focus, though, this morning is I really just wanted to give you a bit of a teaser on some of the clinical, dare I say, more the direct practice aspects of the work. Like, sort of, if you take this concept of resilience, what does it actually mean in terms of direct practice with people who have gone through incredible adversity? And I just want to sort of, I mean, obviously we won't be able to get through a huge amount of material. I have about an hour and a half here to speak, and then the break and stuff. But let me, it's always interesting when you kind of start this. I mean, where do you kind of give you a sense of where I'm learning things from? And though I do research all over the world, quite literally all over the world, in fact, I'm just back from just in places like Israel, and I'll be in China and Colombia in the very, very near future, all throughout Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Japan. I mean, so there's a global scope to this, as well as in my own country. But, sometimes, let's face it, you learn the most from the kids and the families that you work with, right? I mean, that's where you get your inspiration for understanding. So a little while ago, I was referred, I do work part-time. I work now mostly as a clinical supervisor when I'm not at the university. And but one of the cases that I actually carried myself for a little while was a young fellow, we'll call him Tony for the sake of it. Interesting young man. You see, Tony is an African-Canadian. We use different words. You can say he's black or African-Canadian. We use different identifiers depending on what the kid themselves wants. What was interesting was his parents, who were both African-Canadian as well, had been raised in Nova Scotia, and they were part of that Empire Loyalist that came up about 200 years ago, not they themselves, but their great-great-great-grandparents. And so they had settled in Nova Scotia, which is an incredibly racist society, incredibly marginalizing place in Canada, as much as I know that's not our international reputation all the time. But so his parents eventually thought, after they had their son, they thought, we want to give him the advantages of a better education. And I'm not sure if this is true or not, but they thought that he would get a better education if they moved from a predominantly black community outside of Halifax to a predominantly white community. And so they resettled in one of the little suburbs outside the city. And things were going more or less okay, they thought. They had, sort of reasonably good employment and this type of thing. And until their son hit about grade 2, and then he came home one day, and he says to his mother and father, what does the N-word mean? Except he doesn't say N-word. He actually uses the word. Do you know what word I'm talking about? It's a very word. It's so derogatory that I don't actually use it, especially in my own sort of social location as a white male. I don't ever use that word myself. So he comes home and says to his parents, like, what's the N-word mean? Because I'm being called that. And he's like all of 6, 7, 8 years old, right? And his parents are just shocked. And where are you hearing this? And he said, well, the other kids are calling me that. So anyways, there's a bit of a kerfuffle, and the parents go to the school, and they try and, get the school to take it seriously, and they don't really take it that seriously anyways. And this kid begins to grow up in a very sort of having to deal with the racism around him. And by the age of 10, he asks his parents to help him out with this a little bit better than just telling the school, can I learn a martial art? So they sign him up for judo, which is a really sucky martial art if you're going to try and defend yourself against racism. It's not exactly kickboxing, right? So anyways, he goes into judo. That doesn't quite work. By the age of 12, he's so frustrated with the adults around him who are absolutely useless at helping him that he decides to take matters into his own hands and begins carrying weapons to school. Small knives at first. And he sort of lets the other kids see them. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, we better back off with the racial slurs. This kid could knife us. Right? And he begins to sort of look around for identities that are really positive and powerful. And what he finds, of course, is, well, if you're a young black male growing up in North America, there's a hugely popular identity that you can adopt. And that's the gangster rapper. So Tony, who's living in little suburban Halifax, begins to look like he's L.A. Crew here or something. He begins, you meet this kid, the pants are down to here, he's got the bling, he swaggers and the walk and the... I can't the hell do it, but he's got his body moving and his fingers going and he talks like, like this and, all that. It's like you're watching a movie script. Anyways, so I meet this kid, and the kid eventually gets referred to me because he was doing all kinds of things with weapons, right? And he was eventually going to go into jail. And at one point, he was acting up and beating up people in the community who kind of dissed him and this kind of stuff. And eventually, the court said, you're either going to go to jail for 6 months or you're going to be on house arrest if your parents would take you home. And the parents agreed because they didn't want their black son fitting into another stereotype of going into a jail system which he would probably never get out of in terms of the cycle. So they agreed to keep him at home. But the courts also said, look, if you're not going into jail system, you're going to stay at home with your parents for 6 months on house arrest with the shackle, the monitoring bracelet, and the whole bit. And he's all 15 years old at this point. That you also have to do anger management. So I got sent this kid to do anger management. I'm supposed to be the clinical therapist who does anger management with this kid. Now, can you imagine that I'm supposed to declaw this kid? I'm supposed to take away his anger and his acting out behaviors, even though the whole society around him is completely evil and racist. I refuse to do that. Thinking about his patterns of coping, I thought to this kid, I said, well, why don't you just educate me about how you cope in an environment which is so toxic as the one you live in? And he began to tell me all kinds of stories about the racism that he was experiencing and how by taking on this kind of gangster rapper identity, he got more respect from the world around him. Now, this is a complicated idea because I'm having to go with, but Tony, this also gets you in jail. He says, yeah, but it's worth it because then people respect me. So this is not my worldview. This is not what I think about resilience. But he is scripting out a set of behaviors that make sense to him. Anyways, so I have to do something, right? We get around to some of the cognitive therapies, the trauma therapies. We get to that eventually. But most of what we first start on is talking to him about his experience of what it's like to live in his community and how he copes best. And I eventually asked him, well, what was going to prevent you from carrying weapons to school and fighting and everything else? And he says to me, Mike, could you just convince my parents to move me into one of the inner city schools where there's a whole lot of black kids? I go, oh my gosh, Tony, this is going to be difficult because your parents have spent their entire life getting out of that community. This is what they strive for, to have you in this nice little middle-class suburban white school. And you want to go back into the inner city school where there's a lot of other black kids. I mean, there's all kinds of racial politics going on here. I hope I'm not making you too uncomfortable on this, but this is kind of what's playing out in my office. Anyways, I said, well, Tony, how does this make sense to go to the school in the city? I don't get it. What's going to happen there? He says, Mike, think about it, which I'm trying to. He says, look, if another kid in that school calls me the N-word, I've got 20 brothers who are going to beat the living shit out of that kid. I'm safe. I don't need to carry knives and weapons to school anymore. I'm safe. Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that an amazing intervention? So what we did was we actually managed to call up the teacher, the principal. I knew the principal at the school downtown, and I called her up. I said, hi, her name is Linda. Linda, I have this kid from the suburbs. I'd like to arrange for I'd like to see if I could get you to do an out-of-area transfer. Would you take this kid into the inner city? And she's already got 200 more kids than she should have in her school. She's already got her tons of other problems, behavioral problems, and the police are on campus a lot, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm saying, but would you do me a favor and take this kid, Tony? Oh, okay, Mike, sure, whatever. I can do you a favor, whatever. We've worked together for many years, whatever. I'll take the kid. Tell me a little bit about him. Oh, that's really nice, Linda. He's on house arrest for violent offenses and uses drugs. How many cups of coffee do I owe you? Right? Anyways, Tony goes to the school, and keeping his word of the bargain, he drops his behaviors. He begins to attend class. If he's going to use drugs, he leaves the campus of the school at lunch hour, tokes up a little bit, and then goes back to class for the rest of the afternoon, which in terms of a harm reduction model isn't too bad, right? He adapts quite well, and he actually begins to do quite well in school, by the way, because he had the capacity. So in other words, we adapted the environment around him, and we made him more resilient. He dropped a lot of his problematic behaviors. There was a little bit of the end to the story, is that unfortunately Tony still sometimes got into trouble with the drug dealers, where he would try to rip off the drug dealers where he bought the drugs from and stuff like this. So there's a little bit of a problem still. Anyways, at one point, we have all these cameras in our schools like you do, right? And one day, Tony literally is called out of the school to the front of the campus of the school, and he goes out and meets this drug dealer and his son, who's also a teenage boy, and on camera is caught this confrontation in which the drug dealer is like waving his finger at Tony, saying, "You whatever, whatever, whatever." We don't have the audio to it, and he's poking Tony on the chest, and Tony normally is the type of kid, he's a good-sized kid, he would have just decked the guy. But the most amazing magical thing happens. Tony pushes back from the drug dealer, avoids the confrontation, and shows that he's totally engaged in school and goes back into the classroom, into the school. He enters the school. Isn't that wild? He literally had found a safe place to go. He had attached, he had a hope for the future. All those things we talk about related to resilience, right? That sense of powerful identity other than the drug dealer, other than the gangster. All of that in a moment is captured on camera as Tony turns away from that life and the violence and the anger and chooses a path that's more socially desirable. We did that. We gave him that path. We didn't work with him individually in a little clinic doing anger management. Okay, I'd like you, when they say the N-word to you, I want you to watch the trigger. Okay, and how does the N-word make you feel? And then what's your alternate strategy? No, Tony, knifing the bastard is not a good idea, Tony. I agree with you, Tony, but it's not a good strategy, Tony. So, what are we going to, really? Am I going to collude in this crap? So we didn't. And he turned from the drug dealer and he went back into school. The only problem was that the drug dealer's son, who was about his age, ran after him, tackled Tony in the hallway of the school, and before anyone could intervene, Tony took out something from his pocket and stabbed the kid 3 times. Didn't kill him, and Tony only went to jail for a little while because it was self-defense. I don't want to make this sound easy. I work principally with very, very troubled kids in very complex social ecologies. And over the last little while, I've been trying to, if you will, understand what it is that actually makes us resilient. And I want to keep this somewhat complex. I don't want to just go on, I don't want this to be one of those raw motivational speaker people, you get off and, you can just believe. Hallelujah. You will be resilient. I'm sorry, that's just bullshit. It doesn't work like that. It's not that personal qualities aren't important. It's that, in fact, the problem is that without a supportive environment and community, it doesn't work. So, Angie, you said I'm swearing more these days. I think I am, eh? Jeepers. It's the kids I used to say all that doggy do. Oh, well. You get to be curmudgeonly as you get older, right? I wanted to sort of just give you a sense of this, though. When you're looking at resilience, of course, resilience is a set of strengths that take place under stress. And they function differently. It's not positive psychology 101. This is a little more different. This is when a strength appears under stress. And stressors can appear in many different ways, right? You've got to think about the severity, the chronicity, whether or not it's at a level of just the individual. I mean, if you're working with a kid and all their challenge is a learning challenge, but they have a wonderful mommy and a wonderful daddy and a wonderful house and a wonderful school and a wonderful community and a wonderful country, then you're really dealing just with a very simple problem, and the kid can probably overcome it with a minor intervention at an individual level. But if you're dealing with social stigma and racism and poverty and crappy schools and bad social policies and governments and all kinds of other stuff, you're going to need to think more ecologically. Just like we also need to think about, do people attribute the cause of their problems to themselves or to others? That's part of understanding a person's risk. And finally, the culture and the context. Now, I'm hoping I gave you enough detail for you to see Tony's life in this nature, in this complexity. And to assess resilience or to think about resilience, it seems like we really need to begin to sort of think about whether or not the risks are really large, like in Tony's life, or perhaps really small. And what I'm understanding from our research and my clinical work is that as you increase the amount of risk that someone is experiencing, the more likely you are to need to adapt environments around them than to focus on individuals. In other words, what we think of as traditional clinical, office-based, one-on-one practice and work is reasonably effective when people's problems are reasonably narrow and small and encapsulated, right? I mean, if I have an anxiety disorder and I'm in a I'm someone, well, like me. I have a good job and well-supported, healthy family life, no major addictions, if you really want to know. And I develop an anxiety disorder. Maybe I just become phobic or something. Probably some sort of CBT-based intervention is going to help me get over that thing. It's very effective. But I'm kind of a unique creature in the world. I mean, numerically, I don't represent the majority of people in this globe. I haven't gone through a war. I don't live in Syria. I'm not a refugee in Lebanon. I haven't had any experiences of severe and extreme exposure to violence. I've never experienced, some of those kinds of experiences. I have some of that. Actually, that's not entirely true, but for in general sense, no, that's not part of my life right now. So you get over those things, right, very quickly. So when I'm understanding resilience, I'm thinking, okay, we got to think about what kind of resources are available and accessible, and how do we make use? How did Tony make use of the resources that he had available to him? Once we changed schools, he changed as well. So I'm beginning to think about resilience in this kind of sense of something that we can facilitate, which gives me great hope for all of us as people who are trying to help, whether we're a parent or a professional in a community. There's also something else to be said about, where you live, the socio-historical context in which you live, as well as sort of just developmentally. Are you a 3-year-old trying to overcome adversity, or are you a 30-year-old trying to overcome adversity? Is going to change what you need to adapt. But so is your historical period. There were some lovely studies here in Britain by a woman named Ingrid Schoon, who's done this whole thing where she looked at people and how they became resilient during the Thatcher years versus the Tony Blair years. I mean, there was a different economy. There was a different kind of sense of social contract with your government and with the community. So you have other resources, right? If you're being well served, you have more options to become resilient. Why do politicians ever want to talk about that? Oh, they love to say, oh, you're resilient because it's something inside of you, But actually, it's about boring old government policies. Does a family in poverty have access to good child care? Or is a family that has very low rates of literacy, especially in the mother, we always blame the mothers, of course, but if the mother has very low rates of literacy and someone intervenes to increase the access to books and educational materials in the home pre-age 5, we know that there's a huge, huge bump in terms of that child's engagement in elementary school and future course through life, including future opportunities to finish high school. In other words, if we give a poor family with low literacy access to books and mentoring and supports at that age, we know we're going to get a high school graduate. We're much more likely to get a high school graduate. That's building resilience. That's creating the opportunity to deal with an adverse circumstance as a community, which I know is really sort of one of the big focuses of some of the outreach work here in Brighton. So you're getting this kind of sense of, wow, resilience suddenly becomes something of a collective endeavor. Clinicians are still important. Tony still needed some anger management help. Don't get me wrong. But only after we dealt with the racism. So I'm beginning to think about all these different factors. And indeed, as I've gone around the world, we have research sites and we look at this patterns of resilience in places like Tanzania or perhaps in Jerusalem, southern Florida. I could take you to Ireland, South Africa, Palestine, maybe China, Russia, or maybe just back to where I live in Halifax. And what we're discovering is that if I was to kind of roam with you around the world, you'd probably see that resilience becomes this pattern where, there's a context of adversity, and then it's our capacity to navigate to the resources that we need. But it's also our capacity to negotiate for the resources that we need as well in culturally meaningful ways. Now, I know that's it's so much easier to say about resilience, it's the capacity to overcome adversity, which implies it's all about me. But I'm going to argue that when we're working with people directly, it's about us facilitating their capacity to overcome adversity. So it's really about these two processes, too. Navigation and negotiation. I navigate. I mean, you're already sitting up on the ocean, right? So you know about navigation, right? I live on the ocean as well. My weather's a little colder than yours right now, but we're on the same ocean. And, if you think about it, right, navigation is not only about my ability to have personal agency and say I want to set up and be motivated to go somewhere. Navigation is also about having a place to go towards. So if you can't go anywhere, what's the point of navigating if you're lost at sea without a compass, right? You ain't going anywhere. So navigation has that sort of double process, personal agency and that place to go to. Think about negotiation as well. I need people to give me things that are meaningful. I always like to say, have any of you tried to set up a program in a community setting where you thought you were addressing the need of a vulnerable population and no one showed up for your program? Or is it just me? That's how that. It's happened, right? And do you ever kind of get the feeling like I didn't quite match the need of the community? I didn't quite get it right. Which is actually what a lot of, I know there's some wonderful big initiatives now going on here in England, funded through Big Lottery, that's focused specifically on resilience. And what they're trying to do, I think, is negotiate with communities themselves to say, what kinds of things do you need to make, not just, all, but, everyone in this community more likely to do well despite the stress that they're experiencing. Now, it's a little bit like, do you ever play the game Mirrors? You know the game Mirrors? Little way of making this visual. So, do you mind just kind of turning to someone next to you in a second? Little game of Mirrors. Several parts. This whole thing takes like less than 90 seconds. Okay. So if you found a part and you put your hands up, you don't have to touch. Just kind of put yourself, go palm to palm, and choose one person to lead just for a few seconds. Okay. And if one person leads and that person moves their hand, the other person has to move. If they smile, the other person has to smile. If you move, they have to move. Could you just try that for like literally 10 seconds with someone? Okay, wait. Stop. Don't move. Part 2, revenge time. The other person gets the lead. Okay, wait. Part 3. This time, could you go back to that very first position? And without predetermining who's going to lead, I know you're all excellent communicators, but please don't decide who's going to lead. No winks, no nods, no any hints. Just go back, and without deciding who's going to lead, just start. Thank you. All right. Now, you moved, or most of you moved the third time, right? Mm-hmm. How did you get there? How did you move? Someone started, perhaps, and did they continue to just keep moving like they were the bully? I mean the leader? Sorry, I meant the leader. They were the leader. Could you feel the tension of when it moved? My experience of working with a kid like Tony, clinically, in terms of thinking about resilience, is that third experience I just gave you. You're in a session with him, and he says to me, Mike, could you get my parents to move me to the inner city school, which has for him a whole set of meanings, resources, safety, hope for the future, identification with his own culture. All the things we talk about. That's what he was looking for. But he's saying, Mike, put me back in this inner city school. His parents are going, risk, danger, woo, woo, woo. You're in this negotiation where Tony is saying, look, follow me, Mike. And I'm going, I don't think I can follow you there, Tony. This looks really dangerous. And yet he's saying, this will keep me safe. So I follow him a bit. I say, okay, let me understand this more. I follow him, and then I say, but Tony, you still have to go to class, and you can't use drugs as much as you do. He says, I'll do that. I'll tone down the drugs. I'll go to class. You'll see. And there's this back and forth negotiation, which I'm going to say is really what guides me in the clinical work, in the kind of work that I do when I'm actually asked to intervene, whether it's in a community setting or a more sort of typical mental health setting. Now, I'm not talking about treating mental disorder here, right? If you notice, I'm not talking about suppressing anxiety disorders or dealing with the anger. What I'm talking about is embellishing the aspects that make us more resilient. Those being, from our research, what I'm talking about is, notice I'm not talking about just simply psychopathology now. What I'm talking about is this resilience thing, and this resilience thing is really about the things behind you. Now, this is obviously compressed a lot, and if you, I do, in North America, sometimes you're allowed to actually sell a book. I understand it's not quite in the culture necessarily of England. We've been having this really funny conversation, but in all seriousness, a lot of this material is now written up in ways that I tried to make it accessible. I write in different voices. There's a book called I Still Love You, which just came out, and it's specifically about this, and it's written as a long-form story about 3 families going through therapy and the ups and downs they go through as they take really difficult kids and try and get them these kinds of things. I'm going to talk about these in a second. But if you're more of a clinician, then the book called Working with Children and Youth with Complex Needs is really the same stuff, but done as almost like an intervention manual. It's really trying to get the skill sets that you see when you watch clinicians, people intervening in young people's lives. So if you're looking for some more reading on this, all I can do is simply say that, please check out the books. They're here at cost. I don't make any money. Seriously speaking, I just bring in the books at the publisher gives them to me at a very reduced price, and that's what they're here for. I say that because quite often people want to read more, and I think that's kind of why you expand on these ideas. What we're seeing, though, around the world from our research, and you're going to see these themes come up, is basically these 9 different things keep appearing about that make us resilient. Structure and consequences are an obvious one, right? It's funny, even when I meet kids in jails or work with juvenile delinquents, kids who have been gone to the jail system, kids with severe conduct problems, and all this kind of stuff, they often will say they really appreciate when someone sets some rules and expectations on them. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to listen to them, by the way. But it does mean that they're looking for that sense that somebody gave, as in the words of one young fellow I worked with, he said, I wish someone had given a damn enough about me to have set some limits on me, but no one ever did. And that's a problem, right? We don't do well in those contexts. Now, the problem is also the consequences, right? Do we get the right consequences to match the behavior? It bothers me when we do this restorative justice stuff. I like restorative justice. I just hate it when the punishment is never, the discipline is never quite attuned to the crime. So the kid graffitis this person's window. It costs £2,000 or something to ungraffiti it. And the kid gets 50 service hours at the local YMCA doing something. How does that work? Does that make any sense to anybody? Who comes up with such a stupid intervention? And it doesn't work. When have you ever met a kid that, oh, jeepers, that was really awful working at the YMCA. That was just horrible. I'll never graffiti another wall again in my life. Jeepers, I've learned my lesson. It's like not going to happen. They go, F&A. I just pulled one on the system, so I can do whatever the fuck I want, and all I get to do is say every now and then I got to go hang out at the YMCA and piss around there for a few hours. Sounds good to me, right? We don't connect well for kids. That they when people are held accountable for their actions, generally speaking, the structure and consequences works very well. But I'm not talking about shaming or embarrassing or punishment necessarily. I'm talking about natural consequences that are tailored well to what happens. So yeah, get the kid to actually go help clean the siding, or at the very least, get a job or earn enough money to pay back not part of, but the full amount of what it costs to clean up the graffiti that they put on the wall. Doesn't that make sense? I guarantee you, we'd have a lot healthier bunch of kids around. We'd have a lot healthier adults, too. I mean, and we'd create better communities if we did such things. I'm also talking in the sense that we also see the power of parent-child connections. And of course, that's obvious. But they get oversold in our work, eh? We always focus on the parent has to be the primary attachment that's going to make the kid more resilient after a deep adversity. And the research doesn't support that as a truth. I know you're handed that as a myth, right? It's a bit of a myth. Because when families are in crisis, actually it's usually other resources around them. Their extended family, the extended tribal group, the clan, the kin, the community, the social workers, the teachers at school. Other people function when the parents can't. And often in the most challenging contexts, it's parents who are really, really struggling. We overemphasize, we oversell the idea that it has to be the parents. The parents are just one of many factors within a matrix for kids that are suffering in contexts of great adversity. Now, I know that kind of goes, hang on a minute. Are you sure about this? Really, really, when you go, and as you go around, especially when you start working across cultures, this is particularly poignant. That when that it's just this myth of it has to be mom or dad just is not sustained by the research. I'm sorry. Yes, kids need an attachment to a caregiver, but they also need attachment to many other people. I like to say, if you're a parent, how many of you are actually parents as well? Do you encourage your kids to talk to strangers? I hope so. Very good thing to encourage children. They should all go out and talk to strangers. Because that's what they want. What do you want? You don't want your kid ever talking to a stranger? Of course you do. They're going to be like social misfits if they don't know how to talk to strangers. I can't talk to you. I can only talk to 3 people. They're not strangers. I can't order a coffee at a restaurant. I can't go to the registrar at the school. I don't know how to navigate through the bus system. I get lost in downtown London. I don't know how to turn to somebody. It's like, you want your kid to talk to strangers. You want them out in the world. You want them having social skills. Which kind of is what the whole fourth thing is. You want them to have healthy peer groups. You want them to reach out to others. You want them, I always like to say that if your kid is driving you crazy to parents, did anybody have an older brother or sister who was a pain in the arse to you, that used to sit on you and deny you food and wouldn't let you use the remote control of the television? You had those kinds of siblings? This is the time for revenge. What you do is you take your own obnoxious 13-year-old and you put them on an airplane or a train or a bus and you send them to your older brother or sister for a week. You inflict your child on them. And in the process, the kid expands their networks of associations and learns how to adapt in other homes. These are the kinds of things we see, and I'm playing with these ideas, but in a more serious way, we're seeing when we intervene in kids' lives and we open up the network of people that they're connected to, generally speaking, what happens is they get this powerful identity. They get a genuine sense of themselves as somebody who can adapt and fit in. Tony was a young black kid growing up in a racist society and looked around and said, the only identity I can find that's powerful is to be this gangster rapper. When we offered him a different pathway, when we changed his environment and said, you can also be an intelligent kid, a successful kid, a kid, who can be proud of being black, and we're going to put you in a zone where that you can express that, he adopted that identity as well. He didn't need to be the gangster rapper. Now he can just be a proud young black man in our culture, whatever that means in that particular context. There's a sense of control as well that's really, really important in the work that we do. Kids need to feel like they're able to have a say over things that are important to them. And of course, they also need a sense of belonging, spirituality, a sense that your life has some bigger purpose. We see that again all around the world. And I'm going to say that we also need to give kids a sense of their rights and responsibilities to others. And we know that kids need a sense of safety and support. They need to know that when they wake up in the morning, not only do they have a sense of belonging and purpose in life, that somebody will notice if they don't get out of bed, but that we also need to show attachments. So let me ask you, let me just think about it. Here are some simple questions that I'm going to argue people need to answer. Try this for yourself, just as I walk you through. Think about these questions. If we were assessing your resilience for a moment, how would you answer these questions? And think about this from the point of view of the people that you work with, who are more vulnerable. How would they answer these questions? So, can you answer the question? Number one, for structure. There are people in my life who expect me to do blank. Do you have that? Do you have a spouse who expects you to come home and do something, like maybe empty the dishwasher, maybe cook, maybe clean, maybe walk the dog? You know what I mean? There's a sense of order and expectation, and that someone is relying on you in the world. What about the second question for consequences? When I don't meet their expectations, I know that blank will happen. Isn't there a sense of a little bit of security that if I don't go to work today, or if I bugger off too many times, that, okay, there's got to be some extrinsic motivation here in our lives. We seem to appreciate the routine, the security that brings. Not everybody, not every personality type, but most people. Number 3, the parent-child or other relationships. I can reach out to my blank to get help when I need it. That's usually a measure of a connection, right? Whether you're 3 years old or 30 years old. Is there that sort of intimate caregiver, intimate partner that you can reach out to? Let's see. For identity, I feel respected for what's special about me when I'm with or at or doing something. Would you say you have that? And if it's not work, in your work world, do you have it someplace else? Right? That's what people seem to be looking for. That's what the people we work with are looking for. Power and control, it operationalizes as, so in my blank, I get to participate in making decisions that affect my blank. So, Tony, in my school, I get to make decisions that affect my curriculum or how people treat me. That we're looking for those experiences of power and control. Belonging, spirituality, or a sense of cohesion, right? At my blank, people miss me when I'm not there. Would any of you say that? If you did not get out of bed this morning, would anyone have called? Would anyone have noticed? Right? That there's that sense of that okay, I'm connected to others. Sense of culture, right? There are places such as blank where I can celebrate my culture and my beliefs. Very powerful sense of resilience as well. And then finally, rights and responsibilities or social justice, right? I will ask, because you can't, do you experience social justice, Tony? You can't ask a question like that, but you can ask someone something along the lines of, when I'm with others at my blank, I feel I'm treated fairly. Would the people you work with be able to answer a question like that? Whether a child has a physical disability, whether a child is racially marginalized or ethnically different, do they feel that they are treated fairly in their communities? As well, when I'm with my blank, I'm responsible for myself or others. Do the people you work with have a sense that they are actually making a contribution to others' welfare? And of course, for safety and support, I'm well cared for by my blank, or I feel safe when I'm with my blank. So let me pause there. How are those questions sitting with you? Makes any sort of sense, or any just pause there. Questions about those? Anything that I've said? Give it a pause. Like an auction, going once. Going twice. Please, hi.
Hi. It reminds me of...
Oh, sure. You might need to turn that on. Josh, can I give you this one too, just in case people want to, just to create at least some back and forth on this, and we'll take a. Hi.
Hello. I'm Mike. Lisa Williams here. This reminds me a bit about. This is making me think about how services are commissioned in the UK at the moment, certainly in England, and thinking about this sort of move towards outcome-based commissioning, which
yes.
Some people if you get this, then fine. If you don't, let it wash over you. Hopefully, you'll never have to brush against it. But those of us who've worked in sort of service strategic or commissioning level, we're increasingly being asked to commission against outcomes.
Yes.
And it's really interesting. I'm sat next to a commissioner from Warwickshire who we do some work with young minds around commissioning. And I'm just thinking it'd be interesting to see how these kind of outcomes to measure services would pan out. Because I read these a bit like, you know, when I'm at my, when I'm having therapy, I feel I'm treated fairly. Or when I, you know, I feel
Yeah.
like I'm well cared for by my service. I just wonder if you have any comments about that.
Well, there are ways of assessing those kinds of outcomes, but the trouble is, do we ask the question? It depends on what you ask, right? So do you ask, as an outcome of any intervention with a vulnerable population, is the overt question of the clinical intervention or the intervention that you've purchased that I'm treated more fairly in my community as a consequence of my treatment? I don't know how often that's a question asked of, say, an anxiety disorder or a CBT intervention, or working with someone who is in an employment, a re-employment scheme, or coming out of a psychiatric facility to try and reintegrate into the community. I mean, do we honestly ask, what are the benchmarks of? See, we know that these kinds of questions predict resilience. The next time a crisis happens, if they have more of what I've just gone through, they are more likely to cope. What I think most of what we look at, though, from outcome measures is the suppression of the disorder. So are you currently psychotic? Do you persist with an anxiety disorder? When was the last time you hit somebody? Are you still criminally involved? Okay, so what? So you've taken away the criminal involvement of someone. Is that a success? Maybe. Now what are they doing? Oh, they're sitting in their basement, isolated and socially isolated and self-harming because they have no friends, no contact, no peer group anymore. And they live in some rotten housing development, and they're really poor, and they have no other opportunities, but they're not criminally involved. So we consider that a success. No, it's a failure. That's a gigantic failure. From a social, ecological perspective, it's a non-productive. It's not what we wanted. So I don't mean to make people squirm, but it's not the goal, is it? No, it's the goal of psychopathologists, people working in that, but it's not necessarily the goal of people focused on resilience. Is that making sense? And don't you, as people, generally want the resilience outcomes? I mean, do you really just want somebody to stop being delinquent, or do you really want them? Yeah. Anyone else? Please jump in on this. I don't. Oh, up here. Hi.
Josh is coming. Can you just say who you are?
Hello, I'm Juliette Starbuck. I'm an educational psychologist. I work with myself, but I also work at University College London. It's more of a statement rather than a question, and it can be made in reference to these speeches here, which presumably, if the answers to all of these were that they didn't have anyone or no, we would be thinking of ways to help them build up this resilience through these means. And I just wanted to state that, in my opinion, restorative approaches, restorative justice, in any context, but particularly perhaps in schools, is an excellent way to bring about resilience. And I have to say that making everybody laugh about one aspect of restorative justice is a little bit perhaps misleading for people. And I'm sure that you appreciate the value that restorative justice has in contributing to the resilience field.
Sorry, and I hope I hope maybe the nuance of that was missed. That obviously restorative justice is not the problem. It's when it becomes that misunderstood, where the victim has no contact with the people they've harmed. Sorry, where the perpetrator has had no contact. Sorry, it wasn't the method. The restorative justice is absolutely fine.
Super good.
But anyone else seen it misused? Or it might be a very Canadian example. My apologies if it's such a Canadian. It's a very misguided part of its use in Canada right now.
Yeah, but I think people who may not know about restorative justice could have thought, oh gosh, is that what they do?
No, absolutely.
Set the record straight.
Thanks for that.
I advocate strongly for both of these things. Thank you.
Absolutely.